Well, joining us via Zoom now is agricultural economist with the National Agricultural Marketing Council, Dr. Sifiso Ntombela. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter, and good evening to your viewers.
All right, so the minister there trying to reassure South Africa that there's no need to panic. Is that something we should take on her word?
I think certainly, Peter, it's something that we have to take. And I think there's something very paramount that the minister has said, that it's not just only her own assessment within the department, but her statement resonated from her intense interaction that she has had with the different players within the agricultural sector, ranging from the captains of industry in the commodities that we import, and in those commodities that we have the capability of producing them internally. I think, Peter, to just reassure the customers as well as the consumers across the country, is that South Africa is one of the few nations within the African state where we not only we have the capabilities of producing and importing the commodities that we need for our food production, but we have a very sophisticated food system that is also blessed with the infrastructure where we have capabilities of putting the reserves that we need to ensure in cases of shocks like we have seen recently, we are able to sustain such shocks and continue to supply food as normal.
All right, so I suppose the big question then is for how long? Because a short-term shock, that's fine, reserves and things like that are good. But once this thing starts to maybe go into a few months, could we now then start to see ourselves struggling a little bit?
Maybe to respond to that question, Peter, I think it's important to say, because South Africa is a very diverse country in terms of environmental capabilities of producing different foods. We are capable of producing a variety of foods, ranging from your animals, which give you animal proteins in terms of the grains as well as the fruits. In those commodities such as rice and wheat, and I think the minister did emphasize that point, where we tend to rely on imports that are coming from different countries. Even if it's in a prolonged period, we are able to source those commodities from the different trade partners that we can be able to source, whether you're looking at the Asian markets or you're looking at the Australia, New Zealand, even some part in the continent. I think what becomes very important, even if it's in the prolonged state where you go in it, we do have the domestic part of it. Let's give you a practical example in the bread space, where most of the customers have seen some prices going up in the last 2 weeks. Is that, should it be in the prolonged space that goes beyond perhaps in July, we are expecting our domestic producers to start kicking in, because our domestic industry is kicking in around September. And fortunately, in this year is the season that is coming from the back of the very good rains that we have seen, and we're expecting some really good crop that will fit in. But as I said earlier on, Peter, we are already sitting in some of the relatively good carryover stock that comes from the last year, which will be able to keep in our processors to ensure that our processing food facilities are ongoing, and we're ensuring that we supply food at the rate that all the shelves will not see space. One thing, Peter, that I must emphasize is that you probably have seen in the past 2 weeks where the prices have been higher than normal. And that is somehow a function of the market where we're reacting in the shock in the global market, because South Africa is interlinked with the global markets. And we have put measures in place together with the government, who's led by the minister, as well as the captains of industries, to ensure that the markets are actually informed and they have a pretty good understanding what is the throughput of the product that is coming into our factories, which will eventually go into our shelters. So we will likely to see the prices starting to stabilize as well in the week or so, in the back of those policy measures that have been put in place.
I do know, though, that there are some areas in the supply and production chain that are of a concern. For example, fertilizer. We import a huge amount of fertilizer from Ukraine and Russia. What that certainly must have an effect, though.
Certainly, you spot on there, Peter. And I think maybe to just give you a bit of a context. So in a year, in any usual year, we import between about 2 to 2.5 million fertilizers, which you usually use for your grains, we usually use for our vegetable and so forth. And bulk of those, because most of our product, we tend to plant them around the period of October towards November. So we tend to use a lot of fertilizers in the second half of the year. So fortunately for South Africa in this case, is that we already at the back foot where we, in terms of the summer grains, there might be still some of the fertilizers that we need for upcoming winter period, but we're likely to have more demand for those kind of fertilizers in the second half of the year. And that gives us sufficient time to readjust our trade protocols as well as our trade agreements in place and look at the alternative suppliers to source some of those fertilizers we usually import from the Ukraine and Russia, so that we are able, by the time comes around the September, October planting period where we usually go heavy in agricultural sector, we'll have about a period of about 6 months where we'll be able to plan. So that gives us a bit of a time. But even in that case, let's get into the context of it. So in that 2.5 million tons of fertilizers that we import, only about 300,000 of those usually come from Russia and Ukraine. So the bulk of it already come from the alternative trade partners of our country. So what I'm really trying to say here is that while Russia and Ukraine is one of the important trade partners of ours, but equally we have also a lot of other trade partners that we usually import fertilizers as well as other chemicals such as your pesticide and as well as the fungicide that we use to ensure that we produce a safe food and so forth. So we could say, fortunately, the timing of it comes at a time where we've already planted our critical food for our consumers and where we are looking at going to the harvest season, and we still have enough time to readjust our planning period in cases we are unable to source those fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, and look at our alternative trading partners such as Canada in the Americans, or we're looking at India and as well as Thailand in the Asia, or any other South American partners that we have alternative to do so. So that's basically the plan that the minister has been very much intensively looking at with different industry captains in the fertilizer industry to say, what are the different scenarios that we have to look at it? Should there be any complications in their trade partners that we can be putting place measures? And I think time is relatively on our side to be able to adjust our plan accordingly.
All right. So bottom line, there will be grain in the stores, but the issue really is going to be prices. And that might be beyond our hands because the global market may decide what those prices will be.
Certainly, you are spot on, and we're hoping, because our markets, because South Africa is much more of a free market principle following that. And we're hoping that if we provide more information, and we've seen that very enthusiasm and they're working together between the industry and government to say, supply as much more accurate and more credible information as you could possibly can, so that you minimize the price shocks that you can see in the market. But I think even on the export, because we're not only just the importer of the products into the country, South Africa is one of the big producers of quality and exporter of products such as in the fruits. So even for our exporters that is trying to put product out of the country so that it helps the country to generate foreign earnings, we are already putting measures in place to say if there are certain issues such as the vessels that might not move into the traditional market that we have, or those trade exporters that have contracts with the Russia and Ukraine, what are the alternatives that we can put and ship that product into that market that are alternative, whether you're looking at Europe or Asia. But also, looking closer in the African continent, because we just signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And our problems is not only just South Africa, because South Africa is a main player within the African continent. So we are also looking at our African neighbors to ensure that it's not only South Africa that is looking at their interests in terms of food security, but within SACU and SADC, we're ensuring that what they use to import through our ports are able to be secured, but also what they are trying to send out into the world, we are assisting them in equally to ensure that that is secured and it's moving into the country. So we're really trying to make sure that we minimize interruption as possibly as we can.
All right, that was actually going to be my next question, that regionally, it may be fine for us to have enough stock and processes in place, but the moment somebody in the region is struggling, we will feel the effects one way or another. It could even be through things like migration, people looking for food.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the very big tasks for the minister when she was engaging with the different players in the industry to say, yes, the first most important question is, are the South African having sufficient stock of food to be able to go on with their lives? But the secondary and the most equally important question is to say, we cannot, because South Africa has that mandate to be able to cater for the rest of the region. And I think because of the integration between the South Africa and within the region, we have established that that will be catered for. So all measures that are put in place are equally catering for those needs that an obligation that South Africa has within the region. And we are very much comfortable that those supplies that we put into the region will be catered for, and the trade in terms of their raw materials, in terms of their food that needs to be given to them, will be catered accordingly. There might be a bit of some challenges, but we're certainly putting measures in place to ensure that not only South Africa, but the region is secured.
How much of an input is fuel and energy in the equation? Because we're seeing fuel prices reaching record levels now.
That is one of the critical components that we call it a silent a variable within the equation. And it's not only just directly into the farmers in terms of the fuels, because it contributes a very big share in terms of the different commodities. If you're looking in terms of our mixture of the chemicals and in terms of the different manufacturing product, you often see that the chemicals ranging from the fertilizers to the electricity and other common can easily reach anything between 20 to 40%, depending on the structure of that farming operation that it works on. We do know that the different industries have given a task to the minister to engage with her counterpart within the energy space to look at the different policy space that can be used to look at temporarily waiver in terms of the whether you're looking at the diesel rebate, which is often been given by government to the farmers, to ensure that you mitigate as much as you could within the framework, of course, what the policy allows in the country, to ensure that the rising cost of fuel does not disturb very much the functions of the farmers to move their manufacturers. You do know that South African farmers, such as those in the grains, because of the pivot tables as well as the big machinery that they move, they rely much on the diesel. So there are already measures in place where we are able to safeguard the operation of the farmers to ensure that they continue to move their equipment within the farming space.
Dr. Sifiso Ntombela, thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us some insights on this food security story in South Africa. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you very much, Peter.